Hello, my name is David Tindall, and I'll be presenting this module. We're going to consider COVID-19 and society from a social network perspective. In this context, I'll provide an introduction to the social network perspective, and we'll consider how social network analysis is used to study infectious disease, as well as other sorts of problems. Partly, I see this as an opportunity to introduce the topic of social network analysis more broadly. I'll also note that while I'll focus mostly on issues around the transmission of infectious diseases, the study of social networks may be undertaken to study a wide variety of different topics relevant to the COVID pandemic. For example, some related topics include things like information diffusion through social networks, protests organized around social networks, and social support provided through social networks. These are just a few. In a few moments, I'm going to show you a clip from a video. This video provides a visualization of a sexually transmitted infection in a social network. The video illustrates the growth of the size of infected network components. The purpose here is to give you an illustration of social network dynamics and visualization. And I'd like to note that similar types of techniques can also be used in the context of social network simulations. So here we can see a bunch of nodes which represent individuals and lines showing linkages between pairs of individuals who are engaged in sexual relations. And you can see that some of the nodes have sexual relations with more than one person. And we can see as the components grow, that's all of the nodes that are linked directly to one another through a chain of ties, more and more people get infected through sexual transmission. So this is just, a quick illustration of how network dynamics work and how infections might be modeled and might be visualized in the context of a social network. Here are the credits for that animation. Now, I've suggested a few readings to complement the material that I'm going to talk about. There's an article in Nature Human Behavior by Block et al., and also an article in Sociological Science by Whedon and Cornwell. And I'll talk a little bit about both of these articles in the context of illustrating key points in this lecture. I'm also suggesting that you read one article in the New York Times, Just Stop the Super Spreading. There's actually been a great number of articles in popular media, including in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Globe and Mail and other outlets that have illustrated various aspects of the ways in which social networks and social network analysis are relevant to thinking about COVID. This particular article focuses on the notion of super spreaders. So, for example, the authors talk about the fact that in their study, only 20% of cases accounted for 80% of the transmission. And this is a particular aspect of social network transmission of infectious diseases. So I'll make a few references to these as we go along. So let's think a little bit about the problem. What we're interested in is the pattern of linkages or social relationships amongst people. These patterns can be thought of or talked about as a social network. The coronavirus is transmitted through relatively close human contact through respiratory droplets. When this happens through chains of human contact, we can think of the virus as spreading through social networks. To the extent to which the characteristics of social networks form meaningful patterns, the analysis of social network analysis, or SNA, can help us to explain a variety of social phenomena, including the spread of infectious disease. Popular interest in social networks has emerged or reemerged at least 3 or 4 times in the past 20 years or so. what do you think has given rise to these different waves of interest? I'll let you think for a few seconds here about if you can come up with what I'm thinking about here. So one point in which the notion of social networks emerged in the popular discourse was in 2001 and the attacks by Al-Qaeda on the United States. This was relatively novel, at least in the context of the popular media, because this was an attack that was not engaged by a nation state, but it was engaged by a network of individuals. And for some media pundits, at least, this was an interesting and new phenomena. Often when people talk about social networks in the popular media, they think about Facebook and other types of social media like Twitter and so on. And these arose more or less in the mid 2000s, the early to mid 2000s. And sometimes when the term social network is used, people think about it as synonymous with Facebook. But actually, sociologists and other social scientists have been studying social networks for quite a long period of time. And in fact, humans have interacted in social networks for tens of thousands of years, perhaps 100,000 years. Another time in which the notion of social networks became highlighted in the media was the original SARS outbreak, SARS-CoV-1 in 2003, severe acute respiratory syndrome. And it was noted by both epidemiologists and by reporters that this disease, this infection was spreading through social network contact. And so there was a rise of interest in social networks then. And most recently, starting in the early part of this year, in fact, in the late part of last year, people are realizing that the novel coronavirus outbreak is also a social network phenomena. And as I said, there's been quite a few accounts of this in the media, and various kinds of network scientists have been engaged in trying to research this phenomena. So I'm going to give you a very brief thumbnail sketch of the history of social network analysis. As I said, sociologists have actually been studying social networks for quite some time, for at least 100 years. But social network analysis and network analysis has been discovered, quote unquote, several times in recent years by physicists and by computer scientists and also by neuroscientists who didn't know about the work of sociologists and basically reinvented the discipline. In terms of theoretical insights, Simmel was probably the earliest sociological theorist to explore social networks in depth, and he was talking about social networks and social network phenomena in the early part of the 20th century. There's been a variety of waves of development of social network methodology. So in the 1930s, sociometry was developed. This is a form of graph theory that mathematicians were involved in. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a qualitative approach to social network analysis that was quite popular, that involved urban sociologists engaging in ethnographies of urban communities and looking at social networks in that context. Also, a variety of different scholars have used archival methods to study social network relations. In the 1970s, political sociologists and other social scientists used a range of techniques to analyze social movements and also social networks in the context of world systems. Since the 1960s, social network analysis has developed from a metaphor into a paradigm, and along with it, a set of research questions and specialized ways of collecting data and powerful methods for analyzing these data. And, one of the other developments is the formation of an organization, INSNA, the International Network for Social Network Analysis. A good review of the history of social network analysis is provided by Linton Freeman in a book called The Development of Social Network Analysis, a study in the sociology of science. So in this lecture, we're going to focus mostly on social network analysis and its applications to studying the spread of infectious diseases and related issues. However, I'd like to note that there's a wide variety of sociological questions that social network researchers can study. And in fact, most of the topics covered in an introductory sociology text can be studied from a social network perspective. Myself, I spend quite a bit of time looking at the role of social networks in the context of social movements and social movement activism. And I'm also interested in social networks and how they're implicated in various issues with regard to climate change. So social network analysis can tell us something about the size of people's networks and how they're patterned. And knowing something about the size and patterns of social networks, in turn, can help us understand something about the spread of disease. Sociologists typically study individuals as members of groups or categories. Social network analysts have observed that group characteristics often play a role in the patterning of social networks.